Ladies and gentlemen, this evening on the Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves talks about a topic that really tweaks my fiddle, and that is, why is murder the best answer? I've been waiting for him to talk about this. I've got several people that I've been just looking for a reason to off. So we'll see how this conversation goes, and I hope you enjoy it as well in just a moment.
Well, good evening. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. It's good to be back with you again tonight. And wow, what a busy week I've had. First week of school, lots of things going on. And of course, this next week is going to be a little bit busier semester for me because I'm in a new room for one of the courses that I'm teaching. I've been in that room for a semester, but not with this other course. And so I've had to redesign some things about this course for this room. So, it's just a lot of things I have to do. Anyhow, I love being busy, and I enjoy doing the things that I'm getting done. Stress can be great for you if you realize it can be, and you just relax in it. Anyhow, tonight I want to talk about violence. I want to talk about murder. And part of the reason I want to talk about this is because, I remember back when I was working at a place called GAF. I used to be a janitor there at first, and then I got laid off and called back as a material handler and what have you. It was a General Aniline and Film. They were at one time a major competitor of Kodak. Anyhow, I was working there, and I remember one time going into this lab that it was my responsibility to clean up. So I'm in there, and I saw this poster on the wall that I thought was rather humorous. And it was a poster of Abraham Lincoln, and the phrase underneath it said, "Honesty is the best policy, but our policy comes highly recommended also." And I thought that was kind of cool. Because it was in a humorous way acknowledging the fact that we talk about honesty as if it's really best. But when it comes time to behaving, we don't really think that honesty is best. And by the way, we've had a show like this before with Greg and I talked about it, where I argued that I don't think that honesty is always the best policy. Not that we're interested in deliberately lying, but I do think that some people are interested in using certain truths they can get a hold of to use them in an inappropriate manner, and that they're not really entitled to know what the truth is, that some things are best kept close to the vest for the purposes of preventing those who would take advantage of you from being able to do so. Anyway, coming down to this concept here, we also talk in our culture. We do. We talk about murder as if it's wrong. We talk about violence as if it ought not to be resorted to. Kids get into fight in elementary school, and oh no, we can't have this going on. And so we try to have disciplinary measures and policies so that we can't tolerate any of this. These kids fighting or getting in fist fights and doing these other terribly uncivil things, or so we say. And yet, in our culture, we find lots of good reasons for not only going to war, but our adult population commits a lot of murders. And the people who commit these murders, many of them really feel at the moment that they're doing this, that this represents a pretty good idea, quite in spite of all the things people say about murder. And, this is in some ways is not really all that new. We like getting rid of people we find inconvenient for various different reasons. We really do. Let's be honest about it. And we're not, apparently, as a species, we don't have a big problem with necessarily crossing certain ethical lines in order to get rid of people in various different ways that we find inconvenient. You know, we can do things that kind of mess up their job, sabotage what they're doing, get them fired, do all sorts of things to get rid of people we find inconvenient, that the things we do to get rid of them is not really all that ethical. We're evening a playing field underhandedly. You know, I think back to something that I remember being talked about even when I was a young kid. I was too young at the time that it happened to know what was going on, but I'm talking about the coup d'etat in 1953 in Iran. Did you know that a lot of people don't know these days that there was a day when Iran actually had a democracy? They did. They had a prime minister. In fact, the prime minister graduated from a college in France. That in many ways this was an area of the globe that was beginning to truly explore some of the Western concepts of running their country, and were experimenting with more Western ideas. The problem was, when people have a democratic nation, they get to decide for themselves what they're going to do, and if what they're going to do doesn't fit in with our agenda, well, then we seem to have a problem with the fact that they're being truly democratic. Now, in my opinion, one of the things that actually happened, and I'm going to take this from here to another story, and because I'm not going to be talking about Iran all night, but what happened was this: that basically Iran was in a relationship with Great Britain that was troublesome to Iran. Certainly not troublesome to Great Britain. In fact, Great Britain knew long before 1953 that the Industrial Revolution and the military that operated within the West really needed that oil that was there. And of course, one of the things that Great Britain had done, the UK had done, to make sure that they would have access to oil, is they had gone to countries like Iran and built for them many of the oil wells. They engaged themselves in a great deal of the technology and the research, and under the promise that these people could be truly benefited by our technology coming in there and getting this oil out for them. The only problem was that part of the deal that they got themselves into was something called the British Iranian Oil Company, which basically was a deal where the Iranian people ended up with a very small sliver of the pie for the oil that was coming out of their country. And in the democracy of Iran, they were really thinking in terms of privatizing and maybe something else with their oil, so that they were thinking of backing out of the deal that they had with Great Britain in terms of its terms. They weren't necessarily talking about no longer being an ally or supplying the oil. They just thought that since this was the oil under their ground, that perhaps they really needed a far better deal rather than something that in perpetuity looked like it was always going to be, just because, you know, the British helped them get going, that now forever they're going to be stuck with a deal where they end up with the least amount of money. Well, this really concerned people in the West, because they thought, oh my gosh, our oil prices are going to go up. And it's true. It probably would have sent the oil prices up. But you know what? That's tough. You know, so much for those people who talk about a free market. Anyway, what happened was this: because the democracy of Iran was curious in experimenting with certain things we would call a socialistic approach to certain problems, of allowing the government to own and operate and manage certain things, much the way we try to manage utilities here in the United States. This caused people to say, aha, let's spin a story here. Let's tell people that Iran is not really going democratic, that they're starting to go socialist and communist, and that this is a serious problem. And so the news began to get stories pumped to it that were trying to undo the credibility of Iran. And in the meantime, the United States and Great Britain, in a manner that involved our secret services and our CIA and various things, developed a coup d'etat that was really orchestrated by us, that ended up bringing in the Shah of Iran. And that these things, the Shah who came in, who was going to be more of a dictator and ruin their democracy, was at least going to be making a deal with us. And by the way, this is the end of the British, the British Iranian Oil Company, and this is pretty much what had to do with the birth of BP, British Petroleum. And so this was the New Deal and the way it was going to work, and that concept of nationalizing their oil so that it could be truly to the benefit of the Iranians, the oil under their ground, was something that ended up being nixed and taken away from them at that time. But we did that. We took apart their democratic government because their democratic government dared move in a direction we didn't want them moving in. And so we found a way of basically murdering their government. And then the Shah turned out to be a far more despicable person than we had anticipated. And it wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s, somewhere around there, that the truth actually came out about how that coup d'etat actually took place, who financed it, and what brought it out. And of course, by that time, it's 25 years later. It's a little late to actually correct the problem or do anything about it, but we discovered that we did it. Why? Because we didn't like the direction they were going in. And of course, we've been doing things like this in the Middle East that a lot of Americans don't know about for years. Covertly, we give to Saddam Hussein all of these horrible weapons. We even have pictures of Donald Rumsfeld out there, meeting with him back in those younger days, and things like this. That then turn around and backfire. And you know what? One of the reasons why we knew they had chemical weapons is because they got them from us. This is where they got some of that technology from, and where they got some of those supplies from. Anyway, so we've been creating a mess there in many ways. This is somewhat aside to the point I'm headed at for tonight. We've done this because we wanted to, because we weren't really as honest as we thought, as we talk about being, because we were not willing to face the real risks that a real democracy has when a sovereign nation can make decisions for itself based on what it thinks best for itself. If that ends up being something that is a deal we don't like, we think we have the right to go in there and do something. And that reminds me of Vietnam. I was drafted during the Vietnam era. I didn't go to Vietnam. I didn't have to, fortunately. But this is a war where we're going to war because we had this concept called the domino theory, whereby we thought that if communism is going to spread, it's going to spread and threaten our democracy. And the story's never told. I don't see how communism spreading in countries that are willing to try it is in any way a threat to what we're doing over here, unless you want to spin it as such. But also, when a sovereign country decides, or because of its own problems, is coerced internally into accepting a government we don't like, that's just none of our business. But we want to go over there and fight a war, put Agent Orange all over the damn ground, and all kinds of other things over there to really be the bullies of the world, all because we don't like their government. Somewhere we have to ask what's the ethics behind such a thing. You know what? I do like democracy, and I really don't think that communism represents a better way of doing things. But you know what? People have to figure that out for themselves. It's not our job to, behead their governments or to decapitate what they're doing just because we think they'd be better off with a different form of government. It's not our decision. And if we want to really demonstrate how awesome democracy is, then let's be awesome at it, so that when they see what we're doing, they go, we want to be just like they are. Let it commend itself. But anyway, so that doesn't happen. That's because in this world, and by the way, these are just some examples. It's not as if we're the only bad guys. We're not. The world is filled with people all over it, from all different sides, all different walks of life, all different philosophies, all different persuasions, who, when push comes to shove, are willing to do all kinds of horrible, awful things in order to not have to deal with the consequences of letting other people be who they have every right to be, to choose for themselves. And people even have the right to be wrong and to make mistakes. They have the right to learn on their own from their own mistakes, instead of being pushed and threatened and attacked and all this. And the truth is, a lot of these things happened back before, when we were the aggressors going in there and doing these things. And if there was any aggression going on in those countries, it was internal aggression and internal conflict. Now it's gotten to the point where this has graduated to people who are really coming to the United States for they're now bringing that aggression to us. But a lot of Americans fail to realize that, and by the way, I condemn that, because I condemn the war, I condemn violence, I condemn this as even a reasonable way of approaching the answer to any of these problems by any side. But they're doing this now because of all of the things that have led up to this, up to now. This is the next stage of that game that we thought we could play before without even American people knowing about it. And I'm afraid that in some ways our chickens are coming home to roost. That doesn't make it right, and that doesn't mean that we should just sit here and eat that kind of chicken. We certainly shouldn't, but we've got to be honest about who created this recipe. Now, when I'm looking at this, I want to move on to something else here now. I'm thinking of other people who experience some of these problems. I'm thinking of, some of the murders and assassination attempts we've had, or assassinations, remain mysteries, like the Kennedy assassination. I don't know that we'll ever really know what really happened there or why. We'll never know if this was just some sick fellow who had some serious personal problems, somehow just being led astray, or if there was actually some sort of meddling going on behind the scenes that instigated and kind of guided that into occurring. But nonetheless, we find John F. Kennedy being assassinated, and this country really was shocked by that. It was a startling experience for us to go through that, and in some ways, this is one of the reasons why they think that when the Beatles came on the scene, one of the reasons why the atmosphere was just so primed for us to be lifted up by something in the entertainment world, because we were already a people very discouraged and very downhearted over the assassination of our president, even people who were not of his party. But here's a man who dies senselessly, needlessly, and as is true of many assassinations that occur. And then I think of even the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. The guy who shoots Ronald Reagan doesn't even have a political agenda. Evidently, he's really just constructed some sort of a concept in his mind where he thinks this is going to impress Jodie Foster. And so this is a situation where I think it becomes quite clear that the guy who did this was somebody who was in many ways just radically unstable, and had just a weird concept of what was going to be able to impress Jodie Foster. And it's a shame that Jodie Foster was the person he was somehow just so enthralled with, because she certainly didn't do anything to invite this kind of attention. I think she's a brilliant person and an amazing actress. She's done just so much that is amazing, and has been in this business since she was a child. All the way from Freaky Friday and earlier on. But anyhow, so this was in some ways just a bizarre occasion, the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. So I'm recognizing and understanding that a lot of the violence that we get involved in is in our country is senseless, meaningless, somehow the result of unstable people. But we have murder and violence going on in this country that we want to think of as something less than or other than being unstable and mentally off. But people who are involved in a great deal of killing because things aren't going their way. And this includes not only war, but other things. For example, I think of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was a man who had a dream. He certainly wasn't a perfect man. We know some of the things that he was involved in where he had certain faults. There's reports of his earlier womanizing and some of the lack of discretion that he may have had. But I don't think that any of this in any manner brings any kind of shadow upon the genuineness of his dream. He had a dream, not where people of color would end up turning the tables and becoming the dominant race. He had a dream, and he preached that dream of people coming together and sitting down at the table as brothers. He had a dream that he expressed where he was looking for equality. He didn't want one person over the other. He didn't want anyone being dominated. And he was trying to preach that message at a time when people who had been dominated were filled with a great deal of appropriate anger and rage for some of the absurd ways they've been made to suffer that a lot of white people had no empathy to even be honest about. And yet this man responds with an unusual love, with an unusual vision, with an unusual desire to see this resolved in a way that's best for everyone. That's an amazing thing. I've heard that speech a number of times, and I tell you, I get chills every time I hear it. When I hear what he had to say, see what his dream was, I'm impressed with the quality of character and of consideration that goes into that, and the vision that represents in terms of where we really need to be that possesses a future. And so what do we do with people who present that kind of an amazing and awesome vision? Well, we shoot them. That's what we do. We shoot them. Because you see, they're going to change the power structure. They're going to alter the way we're doing things. They're going to mean that the advantage that I have as a white person is now going to be in competition with the entire population, not just other whites, and this kind of like dilutes the soup, doesn't it? And so we find this to be radically inconvenient, and we don't like what that's all about. We don't like those changes. And so what are we going to do? We're going to shoot the guy. That's what happened. This is what we do with people who present to us a radical truth, an honest assessment of where it is we're going and what it is we need to do and how it is we need to consider changing. And if we find that that's going to upset our power struggle, upset our advantages, alter the tables so that they're really equitable, well, we don't want that. So what do? We resort to dishonesty. We resort to violence. We resort to murder. That is the kind of things we human beings do. Now, there's something interesting in this, however, that I think is very that we don't want to lose. Martin Luther King was murdered. He was shot. There's a sense in which, as terrible as that was, that in and of itself radically changed the civil rights movement. Because although there have been many people who you can find were killed and murdered as a result of the lack of civil rights, the kind of racism that existed in this country, although there were many people who died who were well-known deaths in this country, there was no one yet who had died actually preaching this equality, actually coming back with a redemptive message, actually coming back looking for healing and reconciliation. When Martin Luther King comes out preaching that way and teaching that way and talking that way and starting to get very effective, when we shoot him, it becomes extremely clear what length we are willing to go to not have our power structures messed with, that we won't even put up with things like love, equality, reconciliation, and brotherhood. There is absolutely no way we're going to tolerate any of those awesome and wonderful things if it's going to upset our lives. We'll shoot them instead. I think of George Carlin's little rant that he went through. I don't remember all the people he named. He talked about all these people in history that we've killed because, they were just trying to teach us love and wonderful things. He even mentions Jesus in it, even though he's not really a theist. We just shoot them, something, wham, right between the eyes. Apparently, we're really not ready for that, he says, and it's evidently true. But every time we have killed one of these kinds of people, it shows what lengths we're really willing to go to in order to have our way unfairly, in order to have our advantages that we really shouldn't have, in order to resist the opportunity for other people who are as worthy of it as we are. And we can tell all sorts of stories to try to justify what we're doing. We can spin it. We can be dishonest. We can even talk about the lack of character that exists in many people who are poor, who've been kept poor by inappropriate policies and haven't had the opportunity to develop, even anthropologically, some of the strengths and heritages that are a part of the things that give us the advantages that we have. But this is what we do. This is what we do. We kill. We murder. We take care of the problem. We fix it the way we want to. Now, unfortunately, that's just the way we go about doing it. And, I do think, though, that when it comes to, let me just say a few more things about Martin Luther. In some ways, although this is radically tragic and there's nothing good about it whatsoever, it is fortunate that we can, as people, sometimes take useless and meaningless events and find a way of turning that energy into something good. Now that we know the lengths we are willing to go to get rid of somebody who will talk to us about equality, love, reconciliation, redemption, and setting things in a manner that is truly of benefit to all of us together. Now that we know we're willing to go to that length, suddenly many people of color were very clear on what it was they were up against. They became very serious about what it was they had to do. They became very determined in making sure that they would do it. In many ways, that death brought a great deal of clarity to just what it is we're up against and what we need to do. And that clarity was not only there for blacks, that clarity was there for whites who now had to start admitting that there's really something wrong with the way we have been in control of all of this, and starting to make concessions and changes and recognizing and beginning to look at things, even advantages we didn't realize we had that we just took for granted. And many of the advantages that we had, never personally intending to do any harm to anybody else, let them get a job the same way we did, not pretending that is even possible. But that death brought a great deal of clarity. I want to now go back to talk about another death. You see, I think that it would do an injustice to Martin Luther King if we were to somehow talk about how his death was that wonderful event that brought such great clarity to the civil rights movement. That's obscene if we were going to talk about how wonderful it is that he got killed, you know. That no, it is not a wonderful thing. It is a horrible thing. And in fact, it's precisely because of how horrible and unacceptable that death is that it does bring the clarity that it brings, fortunately. But we can't celebrate that death. We can't act as if this death was such a wonderful, good thing. You won't find people, parading around celebrating the death of Martin Luther King, unless they're people who are part of the KKK or something like that. But I want to go back now to a death that occurred a long time ago, a murder that occurred a long time ago. And this is something that I find obscene about much of the tradition that we find in Christianity. We have taken something that happened to Jesus and we have turned it into something that is wonderful. Jesus was murdered. He was killed. He came, I'm of the opinion that Jesus came to confront the ways in which Yahweh was a cult. He came to confront the absurdities of where Hebrew faith was. Jesus came and confronted that. He called these people hypocrites, these super religious people. He did such things as telling them that, if they were going to be consistent, they would have to start poking their eyes out and cutting off their hands if they wanted to pretend they were anywhere near as pure as they claimed to be, or as they thought they had to be. And Jesus also, he would do such things as preach about how, if anyone breaks the least of these commandments, he shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And he starts preaching in a way that gathers their ears. And then having had their ears, he then starts saying, you have heard it said, but I say to you. And he begins teaching things that are contrary to the least of these commandments. You see, I think people have been misunderstanding where Jesus is at, what he's doing. I see Jesus as somebody who, like Martin Luther King, came into the day intending to say, this religion you have is a fake. This religion that you have is outrageous. And I am coming not as your Messiah, but in place of your Messiah. I am coming to do away with your concepts of Messiah. I'm even coming to do away with your concept of sacrifice. And I think he knew that he would end up being murdered in the process. And there's a sense in which the death of Jesus shows us clearly the kind of lengths we're willing to go to get rid of somebody who's going to be upsetting the apple cart, altering our religious traditions, somebody who's going to dare to do this. And there's a sense in which his sacrifice, in that sense, is a displacement of this sacrificial system and a fulfillment of it only in that sense. This was outrageous. There was no reason for Jesus to have to die. God didn't really require it. That was only part of the cult that had that kind of nonsense in their theology. Jesus died. We killed him. He was inconvenient. We didn't like it, so we murdered him. That's what happens. And to me, this is something that can bring to us great clarity. But instead of bringing great clarity, Christianity developed this traditional way of looking at the crucifixion where we've turned it into the great blessing that God has granted upon us. Now, I'll tell you, clarity can be a great blessing, but I think that we've done this in a manner where we've completely ignored the fact that this was an obscene death, an unjustified death, an unnecessary death, a death that in many ways points the finger back at us. It was certainly not a finger pointed by God at us. It was a finger pointed by us at Jesus, talking to us about love. I have a viewer comment here. Let me take a look and see what this viewer comment is. Bob, do you think that Jesus came to do something in a different way in which Martin Luther came to do something? Oh, I mean, yes and no. I think that Martin Luther King saw a circumstance and a situation that was absolutely abusive for people he was very closely identified with. And I think he sought to deal with that situation as best he could. And I think that he did do that. In a similar way, I think that Jesus Jesus comes to us in a situation where we are engaged in an absurd cultic religion that is violent, that is abusive even in the way it defines God and defines man and defines even the way to God. And Jesus finds that this is particularly offensive in the way that it creates outcasts, in the way that it creates people who are labeled sinners, in the way that it destroys the genuine well-being of the spirituality of people who have no need to be put down in the way that they're put down or abused by the people who have risen to the top of power in the religious world. And Jesus came and saw this as something to be toppled and indeed put forth an effort to do so. And I think he knew from the very start that this was not going to succeed without his death bringing clarity to it. So I think he willingly moved forward, knowing full well what that cost was going to be. And in fact, I think Jesus even told us, there's times I think this verse gets misused, but if you're going to follow me, I think that when Jesus is talking about, he's not talking about people who just admire him, people who believe what he preaches and teaches, but there will actually be some people who will follow Jesus. That is, not all people who believe in Jesus, but some people who believe in Jesus will also rise up to speak against the evils of their day. Some people will actually rise up and follow Jesus in that sense, and they're going to find it's going to cost them their lives too, very likely, or at least they're going to sacrifice a great deal, because the truth is they're going to be coming against a world that doesn't want any part of this and is willing to go to great lengths of violence and murder to put up with such people. And so I do think that Jesus sees that. But what I'm hoping to communicate tonight, if I can, is the notion that Christianity has turned into something where we use the cross as a symbol of tremendous grace. We speak of it in tremendous reflection as if Jesus had died in our place, a place we should have died. And we've turned it into, and unfortunately, I think that this cult of Yahweh that I see Jesus as having come to destroy, in some ways ends up taking over that kind of mindset in Christianity, so that Christianity, within a very short period of time after Jesus is gone, has become just another religion with a same old abusive power play story, trying to take advantage of people who just want to reach out and know the love of God. And people who might even struggle in various ways where the rest of us might have an advantage. And we get to basically oppress them spiritually and religiously. And I think that Christianity turned into, eventually, the very kind of religion that Jesus came to destroy. Christianity became the very kind of religion that killed him. And part of the way that happened was in our converting the obscene aspects of his death. He was murdered. Jesus was murdered because that's what we do to people who teach us to love our neighbor as ourselves. I think that we need to realize that each of us are struggling to find out what love is. Each of us are struggling to know love. Each of us struggle in different ways. And many of us have, fortunately, even found a good measure of that. But none of us have found enough of a measure of that we are quite prepared to make sure that this is a measure that can be given to all people. We want to still invent reasons why this is not going to be allowed. And in so doing, we have actually kind of rewritten and twisted our Christianity into something that guarantees that as a religion, it stands against the very things that Jesus came to do and to accomplish. And this is why some people will find themselves having to stand up against the church, having to stand up against theology, having to stand up against fundamentalism, having to stand up against Jerry Falwell, having to stand up against Pat Robertson, having to stand up against all sorts of people who have no clue the kind of evil and abuse that is spewing out of their mouths toward people who are actually quite precious, even if a bit lost. You know, it's such a shame. It is disgusting. In fact, it's just as disgusting as the murder of Jesus, in my opinion. I'm afraid we really need to take a step back and re-examine what it means for us to be people who believe in Jesus, those of us who do. To the point, I tell you, sometimes I'm not really comfortable with the word Christian. In terms of what it means to me, I'm totally comfortable with it. But in terms of what that word really means to the world, I really feel a need to distance myself from that. And sometimes I identify myself as a Jesuist, not a Jesuit, a Jesuist. Instead of going off of the title Christ, going off of the name of Jesus, it's just finding another identifying label that seeks to be something other than that other label. And fortunately, that's a label that gets used by a lot of people who are simply people who, in one way or another, admire who Jesus was. Some of them might think he was God, some might not, but they all somehow admire something about him. And so Jesuists are those people who find themselves very much attracted to the life and teaching of Jesus for a variety of reasons. I personally believe that Jesus was a visitation of God to us. In terms of what does that really mean, I don't know, and I don't care. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is, are you going to love your neighbor? Are you going to hear the message? Or are you going to kill the guy because he's telling you about that? I don't think that the point has anything to do with, and I don't think that Jesus was even that himself all that concerned about what we do with him metaphysically. What are you going to do with his message? What are you going to do with the fact that he did come and say these things? These are the points that I think that are most important. And I think we need to really think about them and struggle with them and work with them and ask ourselves some honest questions and be honest with ourselves about what is it going to take? What sort of advantages am I going to be unwilling to give up in order to be kind and loving to my neighbor? Am I willing to be extremely dishonest? Am I willing to sabotage other people's efforts? Am I willing to actually resort to violence? And if I would like to tell myself that I'm not, I would even wonder if, going back to what I've originally talked about, politically, it reminds me of these kids fighting in the schoolyard. And, you interrupt these kids who are fighting in the schoolyard. And what do they tell you? Almost every time, he started it. No, he started it. No, he started it. No, he started it. And they're immature little kids. And I ask you, are you trying to tell me that these adults are any less childish in their resorting to violence under the justification, well, they started it? There's no doubt that there were tensions that were building up even with those little kids in the schoolyard. Tensions that we as adults would kind of smirk at and see as being so childish as to not really be all that important. Well, they're very important to those kids because that's all those kids know. That's their level of maturity, and that's their whole world. In fact, I think it is actually very abusive to try to correct kids who resort to violence by dismissing it as mere childishness. They're dealing with it in a very counterproductive manner, but dealing with issues that to them are very important. And we need to do that too. As adults, we need to realize we are struggling with issues that are to us very, very important. But it is no less childish for us to think that what we need to do is to resort to all of this violence. That is insane. It is crazy. It is obscene. It is the same stupidity and craziness that kills Martin Luther King. It is the same craziness and stupidity that has to make sure that we put down the democratic government of Iran. It is the same kind of stupidity that is why they murdered Jesus. And it's the same kind of stupidity we all resist learning from. Now, I'll be honest with you. I don't know what the real answer is entirely. I really don't. I actually do think that there are ways in which we need to be able to resort to force in order to protect ourselves. But I do think that we tend to exaggerate the circumstances so as to justify actual other motives, needs, intentions, and concerns than just trying to put on such a wonderful white hat. I don't buy it. I see it as being the same old, the same old fooling of ourselves, the same old dishonesty that we are with our needs, our advantages, and our situations as to how we want to be able to justify the violence we resort to because we're about ready to be inconvenienced by something such as equality, such as love, such as recognizing the dignity of our neighbor. And this is something that I see back even in the story of Jesus. His death was an obscene murder. It brought great clarity to us, and that we realize that Jesus, who came to us as one who, for all they knew, seemed to be the one who demonstrated himself to be the Christ, the Son of the living God, doing good, doing all sorts of things, but messing up their system. That ought to bring to us great clarity, help us to understand really what we're up against, what we need to do, how serious we need to be about some of these issues. And for the people who are on that power side of it, perhaps it can bring to them also clarity. Maybe it can bring to the hyper-religious, the people who are so self-righteous, to the fundamentalists, to the ardent Catholics and Protestants who seem to want to think that this theology of putting everybody down because they're somehow a sinner by nature. Maybe it can bring to them a sense of clarity for them to realize just what lengths their theology, just what lengths their concept that they speak for God, just what lengths they're willing to go to get rid of people who might come in and actually threaten their system, but by talking about such things as loving your neighbor, as reinterpreting Jesus in a manner that is actually consistent with that message, It's strange to me. Anyhow, these are just some musings I've been thinking about lately when it comes to the death, the murder of Jesus Christ, and the way that we can understand how this does bring, in a sense, the salvation of clarity, but not because of any necessity, but because it happened. And hopefully we can learn from this horrific event. Thank you. My name's Bob Greaves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. Hope this has been useful to you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment on the Florida NCG studios, Dr. John Shook will be joining us once again to talk about various presuppositional arguments and perhaps other topics. In the meantime, I hope you learned a little bit about murder on Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. I know I did, and it was lots of food for thought, and I'll be thinking about it for a long time. Stay with us.